The United States currently has two major political parties, the Republicans and Democrats. In this video, I'll outline every state in the Union and their political trends since the 1948 election. Before I get into every state's political trends, it's important to understand that the Republicans and Democrats have not always stood for the beliefs they stand for today. Notable Republicans such as Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant fought against slavery and secured rights for blacks after the Emancipation Proclamation, and notable Democrats such as Jefferson Davis and Alexander H. Stephens fought for slavery, and later Democrats such as George Wallace and Strom Thurmond fought to keep segregation. Starting in the 1940s, the Democrats began to turn more progressive, and eventually the parties would essentially switch, with Republicans nowadays supporting the conservative right-wing Americans, and Democrats nowadays supporting the liberal left-wing Americans. This explanation of the change in politics was extremely simplified and would really require a full video to properly explain, but in the essence of time, this will have to do. The reason I chose to only show political trends since the 1948 election is that was the year the Democrats truly began to support civil rights, and many Southern Democrats began switching alliances. Another important note is that although this video I will be describing the states as red or blue, a large majority of states have a large population of both Republicans and Democrats, so this video will only touch on the majority opinion. Without further ado, here's every state and their political trends. Alabama is currently a Republican stronghold, with Alabama voting red in 13 elections, voting blue in 3 elections, and voting for an independent or third-party candidate in 3 elections. The only Democrat wins in Alabama were for Adlai Stevenson II in 1952 and 1956, as well as Carter in 1976. In 1948 and 1968, Alabama voted for a third-party far-right candidate who ran in hopes of conserving segregation. For more information on those candidates, check out this video. And finally, in 1960, unpledged electors voted for Harry F. Byrd. Alaska only became a state in 1959, so they have only taken part in 16 elections and have voted Republican in every election except for one. In 1964, Alaska voted for Lyndon B. Johnson, but has remained firmly Republican since. Arizona, although historically a Republican state, has become a swing state in recent elections and could be a huge decider in the winner of the 2024 election. Arizona has historically voted for 3 Democrats, Truman in 1948, Clinton in 1996, and Biden in 2020. Otherwise, they have voted for 16 Republicans since 1948. Arkansas has flipped many times, voting for all Democrats from 1948 to 1964, then voting for Wallace and the American Independent Party in 1968, then voted red in 1972, blue in 1976, and voted red in every election since then, apart from Clinton in 1992 and 1996. Clinton winning was largely due to the fact that he's an Arkansas native and served as governor of Arkansas for more than a decade. California is a state that currently holds the most electoral votes and is known for being a Democratic stronghold, but historically was pretty divided. California has voted Republican 9 times and Democrat 10 times, but has voted blue in every election since Clinton in 1992. Colorado has voted for a Republican 12 times and voted for a Democrat 7 times, but has voted Democrat in the last 4 elections and is expected to remain blue in 2024. Connecticut is another state that is historically split relatively evenly, having voted for a Republican 8 times and a Democrat 11 times. Connecticut has voted blue every year since 1992. Historically, Delaware has been a majority Republican, voting red in every election from 1948 to 1992, except for 1960, 1964, and 1976. Since 1992, however, Delaware has voted Democrat in every election. Although technically a majority Republican, Florida tends to switch between sides, voting for Democrats Truman in 1948, Johnson in 1964, Carter in 1976, Clinton in 1996, and Obama in 2008 and 2012. The other 13 elections, Florida has voted Republican. Georgia has seen many flips throughout its history, voting Republican 10 times in its history, most recently Trump 2016, Democrat 8 times in its history, most recently Biden 2020, and voted for George Wallace and the AIP in 1968. Hawaii is an extremely blue state, voting Democrat in every single election since it became a state in 1959, except for Nixon in 1972 and Reagan in 1984. Idaho, on the other hand, is extremely Republican, voting for the Republicans in every election since 1948, apart from Truman in 1948 and Johnson in 1964. Illinois tends to have periods where they consistently vote for the same party, then eventually switch. Illinois voted for Truman, a Democrat, in 1948, then voted Republican in 1952 and 1956. They voted Democrat in 1960 and 1964, then voted Republican from 1968 to 88, and has voted Democrat in every election since. Indiana is another state that has been solidly Republican, voting Republican in every election since 1948, apart from voting for Johnson in 1964 and Obama in 2008. Iowa is a notable swing state, voting Republican 11 times and Democrat 8 times. Iowa has voted for Republican Donald Trump in the past 2 elections. Kansas is an extremely conservative state, with only one Democrat win since 1948. Kansas voted for Johnson in 1964, but that has been the only Democrat win since then. Kentucky tends to vote Republican, but they have flipped and voted Democrat in multiple elections. Kentucky voted for Democrats Truman in 1948, Stevenson II in 1952, Johnson 1964, Carter 1976, and Clinton 1992 and 1996. Kentucky has voted red in every election since 2000. Louisiana, although nowadays a Republican stronghold, has seen some changes in their political trends. Louisiana has voted for 5 Democrats, 12 Republicans, as well as voting for Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats in 1948, and George Wallace and the AIP in 1968. Louisiana has voted Republican every year since 2000. Maine has flipped many times, voting for Republicans from 1948 to 1960, Democrats in 1964 and 1968, Republicans from 1972 to 1988, and only Democrats since then. Maryland is relatively liberal, voting for Democrats in 13 elections, including every election since 1992. They did vote for Republicans in 1948, 1952, 1956, 1972, 1984, and 1988. Massachusetts is without a doubt a Democrat stronghold, having only voted for 4 Republicans since 1948. Massachusetts voted for Republicans Eisenhower in 1952 and 1956, and Reagan in 1980 and 1984. Michigan is known as a very important swing state, and this trend goes back for decades. Michigan has voted for 9 Republicans and 10 Democrats since 1948. In 2020, Donald Trump broke Michigan's 24-year Democrat voting streak, but Michigan flipped back to the Democrats in 2020. Both Trump and Biden will be campaigning very strategically to try to win Michigan, as it could go either way, and winning Michigan would be crucial for both sides. Minnesota, on the other hand, is a firm blue state, having voted for Republicans Eisenhower in 1952 and 1956 and Nixon in 1972, but voting for Democrats in every other election since 1948. In the 1984 election, Minnesota was the only state to vote for Democrat Walter Mondale, as every other state voted for Reagan. Mississippi tends to choose one party and stick with them for a very long time. Mississippi had voted Democrat in every election from 1876 to 1944, but broke their streak as they voted for Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats in 1948. Since then, they have voted for 3 Democrats, Stevenson II in 1952 and 1956, as well as Carter in 1976. And apart from voting for Byrd in 1960 and Wallace in 1968, they have voted Republican in every other election. Although Missouri has mostly voted for Republicans since 1948, 7 Democrats have won the state. Most recently, Clinton won Missouri in 1996. Montana is a very conservative state, with only 3 Democrat winners since 1948. Montana voted for Truman in 1948, Johnson in 1964, and Clinton in 1992. In the 2020 election, Trump had a 16% lead over Biden in Montana. Nebraska is also a very conservative state, having only voted for 1 Democrat since 1948. In 1964, Nebraska voted for Lyndon B. Johnson. Nevada is historically more Republican, having voted for 10 Republicans since 1948, but has voted Democrat since 2008. The only Democrats Nevada had voted for before 2008 were Truman 1948, Kennedy 1960, Johnson 1964, and Clinton in 1992 and 1996. Historically, New Hampshire is a majority Republican, having voted for 11 Republicans since 1948 compared to 7 Democrats. But New Hampshire has voted blue in every election since 2004. Although in recent years a Democrat stronghold, some analysts are predicting that New Hampshire may flip in the 2024 election. Like New Hampshire, New Jersey has voted for many Republicans in the past, but has voted blue in every election since 1992. Republicans did manage to win 6 straight elections in New Jersey from 1968 to 1988. New Mexico holds the same record as New Jersey, having voted for 10 Democrats and 9 Republicans since 1948. The last Republican win in New Mexico was George W. Bush in 2004. New York is an extremely important state, as it holds 28 electoral votes and usually votes blue. New York has voted for the Democrats 13 times since 1948. The last Republican win in New York was Reagan in 1984. Historically, North Carolina is a red state, having voted for 12 Republicans and 7 Democrats, with 5 of those Democrat wins coming before 1970. North Carolina has become increasingly liberal, however, and the Democrats have come very close to flipping it in recent years. In 2020, Trump won North Carolina by less than 100,000 votes. North Dakota is one of the most conservative states, having voted for a Republican in every election apart from 1964. Ohio is a notorious swing state, and Ohio has not voted for the same party for more than 2 elections in a row since the 80s. Ohio is also historically the most accurate state, having voted for the winning candidate in all but 2 elections since 1948. The only years Ohio has voted for the losing candidate were 1960 and 2020. Oklahoma is another Republican stronghold, having voted for Republicans in every election apart from Truman in 1948 and Johnson in 1964. In the 2020 election, Trump received double the votes that Biden did in Oklahoma. Nowadays, Oregon is known as one of the most liberal states, but this was not always the case. Republicans won Oregon in every election from 1948 to 1960, as well as 1968 to 1984. Since 1988, however, Oregon has voted blue in every election. Pennsylvania is another swing state that leans blue, having voted for 11 Democrats and 8 Republicans since 1948. The only Republican Pennsylvania has voted for since 1992 was Donald Trump in 2016, but Trump leads current polls in Pennsylvania for 2024. Rhode Island is a very blue state, having voted for Reagan in 1984, Nixon in 1972, and Eisenhower in 1952 and 1956, but voting blue in every other election. South Carolina is a very firm red state, having voted red in every election since 1980. South Carolina has voted for 4 Democrats in 1952, 1956, 1960, and 1976, as well as Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats in 1948. South Dakota, like North Dakota, has only voted for 1 Democrat since 1948. Johnson won the state in 1964. Tennessee is a mostly red state and has voted for 14 Republicans since 1948. The only Democrat wins in Tennessee were 1948, 1964, 1976, 1992, and 1996. Texas holds the same record as Tennessee, having voted for 14 Republicans and 5 Democrats since 1948. Texas voted Democrat in 1948, 1960, 1964, 1968, and 1976. Utah has voted Republican in every election since 1948, apart from voting for Truman in 1948 and Johnson in 1964. Historically, Vermont is a majority Republican, having voted Republican in every election from 1948 to 1988, apart from voting for Johnson in 1964, but has voted blue in every election since 1992. Virginia has voted for 13 Republicans since 1948, compared to 6 Democrats, but the Democrats have won Virginia in every election since 2008. Since 1948, Washington has only voted for 7 Republicans, most recently in 1984. Although nowadays West Virginia is very conservative, the state voted blue in 1948, 1952, 1960, 1964, 1968, 1976, 1980, 1988, 1992, and 1996. In the 2020 election, however, Trump received more than double the votes that Biden did in West Virginia. Historically, Wisconsin is a blue state, having voted Republican in 1952, 1956, 1960, 1968, 1972, 1980, 1984, and 2016. Trump was the first Republican candidate who managed to flip Wisconsin red in more than 30 years, but Wisconsin flipped blue again in 2020. At the time of writing, however, Wisconsin has Trump leading the polls by just a little bit. Wyoming is another Republican stronghold, having voted Republican in every election since 1948, apart from Truman in 1948 and Johnson in 1964. Finally, although not technically a state, the District of Columbia or Washington, D.C. holds 3 electoral votes. D.C. only began voting in 1964 and has voted Democrat in every single election since then. In conclusion, of the United States' 50 states and capital, the more moderate states that have historically leaned Republican are Alabama, Arkansas, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Ohio, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Vermont, and Virginia. The more moderate states that have leaned Democrat are California, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Michigan, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Washington, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. The states that have voted Republican in 15 or more of the 19 elections since 1948 are Alaska, Arizona, Idaho, Indiana, Kansas, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming. The states that have voted Democrat in 15 or more of the 19 elections since 1948 are Massachusetts, Minnesota, Rhode Island, and Washington, D.C. Finally, Alabama and Mississippi have voted for a third-party or independent candidate in 3 separate elections since 1948, the most out of any other states. As usual, if you've enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe as it really helps, and let me know who you'll be voting for in the comments. Additionally, if you have any future video suggestions, I'm always happy to make those videos in the future.